I'd like to say thank you very much for having me. I've put my contact details at the top of this page. I don't know who I think I am, but those are the places that you can find me if you want to. The aim of this research is to explore the fact that heritage organisations in the United Kingdom have often failed to acknowledge links to colonialism and slavery, and to suggest ways in which they might learn from the work of plantation house museums in the United States to tackle this issue. Despite so many differences, the opportunities and obstacles faced by both plantation house museums and country house museums are often similar. And the Whitney Plantation in particular offers an excellent example of a successful counter-narrative site, emphasising the importance of the human experience. Obviously, during recent months, some UK organisations have made progress towards doing more in this respect, though the subsequent backlash against research into more complex and complete histories may stifle these efforts. I surely hope not. My hope for this paper is that it contributes to a more nuanced understanding of the role of country houses in telling all relevant histories rather than focusing only on those some audiences find most palatable. In my view, the country house is a box. It is a vessel through which we can tell any relevant story we choose. There is no general heritage rule which states all of our country house museums must lie in stasis in perpetuity, putting forward only one narrative. This approach invalidates the experiences of so many people with links to historic properties, whilst centering all research on the wealthy white inhabitants serves to reinforce the idea that their lives and their stories are the only ones of value. Historically, in the cultural consciousness of the UK, there has often been a preconception that slavery was a kind of turbulence on the other side of the Atlantic that made money for those who could stomach it. For members of the public, this places slavery firmly on American or Caribbean soil, somewhere else. This has been reflected in the way the UK's relationship with slavery is represented by the heritage sector and by the media. For example, there has long been a focus on the abolitionist movement, and perceptions of Britain's relationship to slavery were mainly directed, in as far as they occupied the public consciousness at all, to the role of social reformers. Though recent years have seen some increase in the awareness of slavery and its role in history, as I've said, these have often been concentrated in specific museum spaces and exhibitions, while the majority of country house experiences continue to reflect triumphalist colonial values with a focus on the lives of wealthy inhabitants, whereby links to slavery are erased by omission. The experience of visiting a country house property in Britain and a plantation property in the US is, or has been, superficially similar. Known for their beauty and imposing grandeur, both are often seen by visitors as a pleasant day out, a means to access the countryside, also, at least for me, a good excuse to eat cake. Indeed, they are also often wedding venues, which is an interesting topic within itself, given the history and the purpose of some of these places. Assuming we all have some knowledge of the evolution of the British country house in popular culture, and in terms of its heritage value, it is probably worth briefly addressing how this happened to the American plantation, as there are a number of similarities here, particularly in terms of the construction of a specific narrative and the erasure of others through that. Following the end of the American Civil War, as the South's focus shifted away from the issue of slavery and towards what were often described as Southern values, the heritage and commerce of the Southern states increasingly embraced the Dixie brand. From only a few years after the end of the Civil War, the South became something of a holiday destination for people in the northern states. In the minds of many visitors, it had a natural beauty, or at least exotic forms of natural life. It had big houses, homes of presidents, and battlefields, and it had slavery. These attributes promised a departure from the noise and industry of the North in favour of simple rural pursuits and a way of life firmly rooted in tradition. Thus, the South had largely rebranded itself in a very carefully curated way through a lens of romanticism and nostalgia. As the tourism industry expanded across the South, much of the region's attraction seemed to stem from memories of what Karen L. Cox calls the Old South, a place warm in climate with happy-go-lucky blacks, genteel white women, and a rural landscape awash in moonlight and magnolias. Slavery therefore became a sign of something other, but was not remembered for its atrocities, and enslaved people were largely absent from the interpretation of these properties, except as embellishments or objectified symbols of wealth. Given the grandeur of the region's plantation houses, as we know, these have long been popular with tourists. As organisations worked to preserve the historic features of these buildings, a formula evolved wherein antebellum houses were opened to the public as beautiful girls in hoop skirts identified family heirlooms and antiques to visitors. This formula is of course also common in the UK in some ways, and is almost synonymous with the experience of the country house, whether it conceals a more problematic history or not. The broader context of the purpose and history of southern plantations was rarely acknowledged, and the houses appeared to exist almost entirely independent from the years of sustained violence and oppression on which they were built. Instead, they form part of an agenda of reputational politics that encouraged visitors to the South to view it only in positive terms. For those of us studying country houses, statues, or museums in the UK, this might sound all too familiar. Despite all of this splendour, in the United States, the legacy of slavery is so ever present in the fabric and the landscape of American society that it would be hard for anyone to completely overlook. This is particularly true when combined with the profound impact of the American Civil War. Though the precise causes and nuances of the Civil War are numerous, as many of us probably know, slavery looms up mountainously throughout its story and cannot be talked away. Some historians have argued that the UK's comparative lack of engagement with the legacy of slavery partly stemmed from an absence of physical evidence. Indeed, it has been suggested that the United States are equally limited in this respect, with the exception of plantation houses and grounds, of course. Even then, these are mere polysemic signs capable of many different interpretations unless they are scripted, coded, and marked to anchor meanings in slavery. Therefore, if interpretation is used effectively, there is a significant amount of physical evidence of involvement with the slave trade and slavery in country houses across Britain. We see it all the time, whether we know it or not, and it is illustrated here by the presence of these two sculptures at the National Trust's Dereham Park, a clear sign of the Blathwaite family's association with plantation slavery. Some of these collections or places are obviously linked to colonial violence, whereas others are more symbolic of the wealth that was accrued as a result of the exploitation of enslaved people. This is not always made apparent by the organisations responsible for the care and conservation of said objects or places, and this is evident in the conventional representations of the country house in cultural arenas as a one-dimensional Arcadian retreat, blissfully isolated from political intrigue and the grubby world of trade. The way in which we perceive country houses in the UK is therefore very much reliant on the interpretive choices made by the relevant heritage organisations or museums, neither of which guarantee a particular level of neutrality. Without clear contextualisation, the link is not apparent, and the grandeur of the statues, houses, or objects within are not neutral. They are not saying, here is the past, make up your own mind. They're saying this person or this family was good and great. At the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana, the conventional focus on the life of the site's white inhabitants has been subverted in favour of a museum dedicated entirely to the experiences of enslaved people. Both the plantation and its website have been described as a valuable resource to educators and public humanities scholars who are troubled by representations of slavery that ignore the brutality of the institution and glorify the benevolence of slave owners. Like other plantation properties and museums mentioned previously, the Whitney Plantation is usually experienced by visitors through a guided tour. However, this tour is far more immersive than those one might find elsewhere. During her visit in 2019, National Geographic journalist Heather Greenwood Davis described being given a lanyard to wear around her neck that told her about a specific individual who had lived at Whitney. She was a 12-year-old child who had watched her father die in Louisiana just before slavery was abolished in the United States. This intervention firmly places the enslaved person in the mind of a visitor as a human being rather than an object or a symbol of colonial wealth, thus enabling docents to present the museum as a space of emotion as well as information. Visitors to the museum's website arrive at a homepage and are offered a virtual tour which refers to memorials built to honour enslaved people, as well as slave cabins, a freedman's church, detached kitchen, before finally listing a 1790 owner's house. This illustrates part of the museum's strategy of counter-narrative, which places the least emphasis and importance on the site's big house. The work of the Whitney Plantation to provide an in-depth look at the lives of enslaved people effectively highlights the inadequacies of other museums and heritage organisations by contrast. Evidence has shown that decisive moves to provide augmented representation of enslaved people at plantation properties can have an impact at other nearby sites. For example, Whitney Plantation is located near Laura Plantation and might be driving the inclusion of additional information about slavery on Laura's docent-led tours. And this change at the Laura Plantation seems to have influenced nearby Oak Alley to build 6 replica slave cabins. An example has clearly been set by Whitney's counter-narrative and is proving difficult to ignore when so many other properties had neglected to include it in their own interpretation of plantation history. As is the case with statues, to approach history from one specific point of view or to focus on one narrative only can hinder the interpretation of places and people as complex or multifaceted, and this can raise questions around authenticity or particular agendas. However, in the case of the Whitney Plantation, and indeed museums like the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, it is essential that spaces exist for a more in-depth consideration of slavery and its impact on the world, certainly until the broader heritage sector breaks out of a tradition of colonial myth-making in favour of a more complex and inclusive approach to history. Shifting the attention away from the large plantation house and towards the experiences of enslaved people provides opportunities to challenge historic preconceptions, though attempts to invoke an empathetic response to the site must be approached with caution. In some cases, these interventions failed to encourage an appreciation of the cause or the implications of suffering, instead inviting a reliving of the pain, where individuals are first and foremost concerned with the distress they themselves experience in the process. At the Whitney Plantation, empathetic interpretations of enslaved people and their lives have been created in a way that emphasises the human experience of identified individuals who were enslaved at the site. This not only shifts the conventional plantation narrative to a focus on slavery and its legacy, but the experiential elements of the interpretation help negate a looking scenario in which a spectator seems to hold power over an exposed victim. It does this without necessitating a projection of the self in order to engage with the narrative. The Whitney Plantation's approach also navigates interpretation of slavery without resorting to the creation of a sentimental encounter that adheres to pre-existing notions of white superiority and paternalism. As we have found in both the UK and US, there has been a decisive and coordinated effort to ensure a specific narrative, which glorifies those with influence and diminishes the role of racism and slavery in the development of places and culture. As witnessed by the enduring popularity of Gone with the Wind, the audience for a distinctly nostalgic representation of the plantation is large, geographically extensive, and enduring. This is partly due to continual reinforcement at historic sites and memorials, which shape unconscious learning and public understanding of history. This part of the paper is, of course, not intended as an attack on Mr. Darcy, who for me was the gateway drug to an interest in history. Instead, it is a comparison of the romantic versions of history, both in the UK and the US, that have previously been favoured above all other narratives. Their influence has arguably underpinned much of the Country House Museum's contemporary appeal. Despite years of erasure, it has been shown that clear attempts to refocus the interpretation of plantation properties to include a more detailed exploration of slavery and the lives of enslaved people has proven influential within the sector. This has gone some way to creating better and more equal representation, emblematic of the region's twinned legacies of slavery and enslavement and resistance. There is still much progress to be made in order to adequately subvert the long-established narrative of noble loss, sacrifice, and beauty inherent to the mythology and traditions of the Southern past, all of which have a place in the heritage of the South, but should not diminish the legacy of slavery and the widespread systemic oppression of Black people. I also think Mr. Darcy has a place in the mythology and traditions of our past. Though the UK and US are simultaneously grappling with the issue of heritage and interpretation, some consistency and coherence must be established if this work is to continue in a way that challenges existing interpretations of colonialism. It must also be done in a way that encourages inclusivity across the sector and amplifies Black voices in the recognition and interpretation of history. Historic places and museums can certainly learn from counter-narrative sites and institutions that focus entirely on Black experiences in order to develop a balanced and authentic view of the places and figures they represent. That said, the heritage sector in the UK could also learn from the shortcomings of sites like the Whitney Plantation, where some visitors have felt the tour, though accurate in its portrayal of the harsh, brutal realities of slavery, still subscribed to long-held racist beliefs that enslaved Africans were powerless and passive. It would be more balanced to not only acknowledge the exploitation and suffering inflicted on Black people throughout history, but also to celebrate their achievements and significant works. For example, whilst current public understanding of the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade suggests it was driven entirely by white paternalistic activists like William Wilberforce, significant strides were actually made by a multitude of Black campaigners, including Olaudah Equiano and Frederick Douglass. Furthermore, there are already Black writers, artists, curators, and creators working to subvert colonial narratives, particularly by emphasizing the Black experience and providing an alternative view of historical events. Black history, our shared history is what it really is, and inclusive narratives, they already exist. The complex narratives and the history are there. And it's therefore the organisations and institutions wielding the most power in the heritage sector that prevent the spread of more inclusivity and complex narratives at these places. However, they also have the opportunity to make significant change. Biased white-dominated history has eroded not only the realities of colonial violence, but also perpetuated the erasure of Indigenous African cultures and the considerable contributions Black people have made to societies across the globe. In order to promote a sense of ownership of significant cultural sites amongst marginalised communities, there has long been a need to deconstruct and subvert the cosy and incomplete national story as it exists today. The underrepresentation of Black people and the erasure of systemic racism at historic places and museums must therefore be addressed in order to provide access and inclusion across sites associated with cultural heritage. Counter-narrative sites like Whitney can certainly help us in showing the way forward. And I might have rushed through that like an over-enthusiastic chipmunk, but I am done. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.